Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Europe podcast, available every morning on Apple, Spotify or wherever you listen. It's Thursday, the 15th of May in London. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Coming up today, Vladimir Putin appoints low-level officials for today's Ukraine talks, possibly dashing Zelensky's hopes for a face-to-face meeting.
Veteran US investor Stephen Jen says America could require a Truss moment to force a deficit course correction.
Plus, hitting the brakes on its high-end ambitions, why Burberry's CEO is calling time on the British fashion label's attempt to join the upper echelons of global luxury.
Let's start with a roundup of our top stories.
Russia's President Vladimir Putin has named a group of low-level officials to join peace talks with Ukraine in Turkey today, while giving no indication that he plans to attend the negotiations himself. President Zelensky had challenged Putin to meet him for talks in Istanbul after the Russian leader offered to resume direct negotiations to end the conflict. US President Donald Trump was asked by reporters on Air Force One about the possibility that Putin might attend.
Well, I don't know if he's showing up. I know he would like me to be there. And that's a possibility. If we could end the war, I'd be thinking about that. Now, tomorrow, we're all booked out. You understand that? We're all set.
But you'd go if he goes?
I go UAE tomorrow. And so we have a very full situation. Now, that doesn't mean I wouldn't do it to save a lot of lives and come back. But, I think they're thinking about something. I don't know that he would be there if I'm not there.
The US President was speaking on Air Force One as Zelensky reiterated his willingness to hold direct talks with Putin, even though he said he had little hope the Russian leader would show up. The Ukrainian leader also said that he would not attend talks unless they were held directly with his Russian counterpart.
Meanwhile, foreign ministers in NATO are gathering to discuss the future of European security ahead of a pivotal summit. The diplomats meet in Turkey this morning to establish the agenda for NATO's annual summit in June, where the US has made a higher defence spending target a priority. Germany's Chancellor Friedrich Merz says the West needs to stand together.
It is of paramount importance that the political West, ladies and gentlemen, does not allow itself to be divided. And that is why I will continue to make every effort to ensure the greatest possible unity between the European and American partners.
Merz's Germany is one of the countries taking on large amounts of debt to rearm. NATO estimates that the US currently accounts for nearly two-thirds of the alliance's defence expenditure, with Canada and Europe funding the rest.
The UK is drawing up plans for a special visa for foreigners who invest significant sums in Britain. Bloomberg understands the plans would focus on getting money for strategically important sectors, including AI and clean energy. James Woolcock has more.
Keir Starmer may say Britain's experiment with migration is over, but his government still seems to want foreign investors to come. Ministers are weighing a new visa for anyone who invests in Britain's strategic sectors. The potential move echoes US President Donald Trump, who has promised a so-called golden visa to anyone who pays $5 million to the US Treasury. The UK's proposal comes after a flurry of wealthy residents have left the country after tax changes. In London, James Woolcock, Bloomberg Radio.
The White House has announced deals with Qatar totaling more than $243 billion, laying the groundwork for a bigger $1.2 trillion economic pledge with the country. Now, the agreements include a $96 billion plan for Qatar Airways to acquire Boeing aircraft and a nearly $2 billion agreement for Qatar to buy US drones. The announcement comes on the second leg of President Trump's tour of the Middle East, during which he's focused heavily on securing investment. Michael Froman, president of the Council on Foreign Relations, says the deals could be pivotal.
I think some of the deals are likely to produce investments here and exports, very importantly, to those countries over the medium term. Some are probably more along the lines of agreement to discuss more investment down the road. And the thing about these investments is that it can take years, if not a decade or more, for the shovels to actually get put in the ground, and very importantly, for jobs to be created longer term. But it's very positive when we're selling more exports to other countries, like the planes and the engines that were announced.
That was Michael Foreman, the Council of Foreign Relations president, speaking there. Meanwhile, a separate US-Saudi defence deal agreed by Trump has been called into question, with critics of the move saying that the deal lacks specifics and may include repurposed agreements secured by previous US administrations. Experts have also queried the country's ability to agree those purchases.
10-year US Treasury yields have been moving higher this month as investors weigh plans by Congress to cut taxes while the government is already running a large deficit. But one veteran investor is suggesting the United States needs a Liz Truss moment. Bloomberg's Ewan Potts has more.
The bill currently moving through the House is set to increase the US government's debt by at least $3.3 trillion by 2034. That's the official view of the Committee for a Responsible Budget. The deficit is already large by any normal measure, above 6% of GDP over each of the last 2 years, levels normally only seen in recessions or wars. And that's left veteran investor Stephen Jen of Horizon SLJ Capital wondering if the US needs to see a repeat of what happened to Liz Truss, with US 10-year yields topping 5%. He says it's not enough to warn people about the ballooning deficit. Quote, they need to be punished. Jen adds, I'm not giving up completely, but I'm conceding that we don't seem to be moving in the right direction, and I'm fearful of what may happen. In London, I'm Ewan Potts, Bloomberg Radio.
In his first interview since handing over the reins of Berkshire Hathaway, the billionaire investor Warren Buffett says he made the decision to step down after finally feeling his age. Speaking to the Wall Street Journal, the 94-year-old said that there was no magic moment when he knew it was the right time to retire as CEO, but he had observed how much energy his successor, Greg Abel, brought to every working day and how his own days had slowed. He said that he did not feel his age until he was about 90. But once he did, the process was irreversible. When asked about staying on at Berkshire as chairman, he said, my health is fine. I get to work with people I love. They like me pretty well, and we have a good time.
The actress Scarlett Johansson has said that Hollywood filmmakers are being, quote, muzzled by big tech guys. In an interview with Vanity Fair magazine, the Avengers star noted that many of the people who funded the film industry attended US President Donald Trump's inauguration. She also said boundaries should be set for the use of artificial intelligence, saying she was angered at how eerily similar one of the voices on ChatGPT was to hers. Last year, the Marvel star alleged that OpenAI used her voice without her consent. The company's CEO Sam Altman denied the claims, but did pause the system in response.
Those are some of our top stories for you this morning. Let's get to the markets. So the equity rally wavering. You've got S&P 500 E-mini futures down by 0.2%. Stocks in Asia are falling for the first time in 5 days. MSCI Asia Pacific Index is down 0.3%. US Treasury yields climbed yesterday. 30-year yield briefly touching 4.98 this morning, stabilising since then. You've got markets thinking about the Trump tax bill. Also, recession fears do seem to be abating. The market continuing to price out Fed cuts. So 2-year yields have risen over the course of this week around 13 basis points. Gold has hit a 1-month low, falling more than 1% this morning. Oil tumbling on Iran deal prospects, and also lots to think about for the rest of today. Walmart earnings, US retail sales, and you've also got UK GDP figures today. So those are the markets.
In a moment, we'll bring you more on what to expect from the Russia-Ukraine talks in Turkey. Plus, can Burberry's cost-cutting efforts finally help to turn around the struggling brand? But another story that caught our eye this morning, a big deal in restaurant reservations. If you're one of those people who has to set an alarm to make sure that you're going to be able to book a table at the right time, Uber is now getting in on the act. They're going to be launching their own dineout icon where you can reserve restaurant tables via the Uber system, essentially. And the UK is going to be one of the test markets for it.
Yeah, in September. Uber's offering incentives, of course, a discount on your Uber taxi to the restaurant if you book using Uber Eats. Also, OpenTable have got their own sort of set of incentives for their members. It's going to launch in London and in Sydney. I mean, is this basically the height of convenience? Uber just gets to organise your whole night out. It's
premiumisation, I think, that I'm looking at this as well, because there's going to be essentially a new tier that they're going to be rolling out later, this idea that you'll be able to priority book certain tables if you are
that just annoys me, because then does it leave us all increasingly siloed depending on what app system you happen to use and which tier of user you happen to be? I don't know.
It's also the feature of there are certain cities in the world, and London and New York are two of them, where it is you have to plan things so far in advance, because getting restaurant reservations requires that you essentially know what you're going to be doing a Saturday night 3 months from now to try and get into some of the better restaurants.
Maybe that's your social calendar, Stephen Cow. Anyway, there we are. We will put a link in the show notes if you want to read a bit more about what Uber is planning. Of course, DoorDash, their rival, not to be outdone, they are also apparently planning something similar.
They have a partnership with 7 Rooms, which is one of the other big booking platforms as well. But this does seem to be a move that, there's a secondary market for restaurant reservations in New York where you can buy somebody else's restaurant reservation because there are people who are gaming the system to an extent. I quite like, there's quite a lot of restaurants now that you have to phone them, because essentially that knocks out a whole load of people and stops people double or triple booking restaurants, which, is not something that I've gotten into, but I do have friends that do it.
Yeah, absolutely. Gosh, there we go. Restaurant bookings and new Uber deals coming your way. Right, let's think about, though, the main story, of course, today. Ukraine peace talks in Istanbul in Turkey today are not expected to see direct negotiations between Volodymyr Zelensky and Vladimir Putin, nor actually to involve President Trump, who suggested that his schedule is too full to include another stop on his tour of the Middle East. You heard the little clip of him just in our news roundup. This as the NATO foreign ministers are also meeting informally in a different city in Turkey, in Antalya. Joining us now to discuss is Bloomberg's executive editor for economics and government, Flavia Krauss-Jackson. Very good to have you on the programme, Flavia. Good morning. What are we expecting from today's Russia-Ukraine talks, firstly? Do you think that they could yield any progress?
I think anyone who's going out definitively and saying that the three-way Trump-Zelensky-Putin meeting is not going to happen and might be getting over their skates. I think we've just been listening to mixed accounts. And I think if you're listening to Trump's words carefully, he's trying to essentially coach Putin out. So I think we shouldn't exclude the possibility that this actually may at some point come together later in the weekend. So I wouldn't give up hope just yet on that potentially happening. It would be a huge coup for Trump if it did come through, because just think about it. It's his first overseas foray. Obviously he went to the Pope's funeral, but he's come here in the Middle East. He signed what looks on paper like, lots of deals worth billions, 1 trillion at one point, even though that figure should be questioned. And if he manages to end the trip by diverting, going to Turkey, and who knows, maybe even going to the Pope's funeral, what a trip this would be.
Well, another conversation that Donald Trump is dominating is that meeting of NATO foreign ministers also taking place in Turkey, and questions about defence spending. Could 5% be possible?
I think what we're looking at here is the classic card of the deal, right? Right now, it's 2%, and a lot of NATO members are skirting the responsibilities and not doing that. Rutte, who's something of a Trump whisperer and has been very good in a way at massaging the president's ego and kind of trying to cajole people to spend more, has set the target of 3.5. And obviously there's that aspirational 5%. So will we get to 5%? I very much doubt it. I think it's a hard target, but I think they're setting the scene so that NATO in The Hague in June could be a success. And I think to a certain degree, Trump's invocation that, America is no longer going to have to carry the weight of, defending Europe, and that sort of agreement, that post-war understanding of, the US being the world's cop has ended. And so I think, you can see this in Germany with the fact that they've obviously upped their game there, that this is having an effect. But when these targets will be reached is an entirely different question. Europe is far, far away from being able to do anything to actually defend itself should it ever be in conditions of war.
President Trump's Middle East trip, though, you mentioned, has all these defence deals in it and big price tags. $1 billion deal for Qatar to buy Raytheon Systems, the first international buyer to get this system. Also, it does come with some big question marks, as you've said. The Trump administration calling this $142 billion deal with Saudi Arabia the largest defence sales agreement in history. What are the question marks around all of these numbers?
I think a lot of people are privately chuckling at the ostentatiousness of these numbers. All that glitters is in gold. And I think, once you kick the tires on all of this, you see very much that it all is not what it seems, right? So even look at the economic deals. We had 1 trillion, but actually the White House said 600 billion. And then once you start looking a little bit under the bonnet, it looks more like 300 billion. And it's a very similar case, I think, frankly, with this 142 billion defense deal. I think Bruce Rydell put it very well in one of the stories that, if you compare that to what the Saudi budget actually is, these numbers just simply don't stack up. But I think what we're really missing here is the symbolic value of all this. I mean, it was a proper love-in, right? I mean, MBS was grinning from ear to ear. Trump looked a little bit tired at the beginning of the trip, but, this is the kind of trip he loves. It's all about the money, the deal, the camaraderie. And on even though the glitter of the $1 billion deals isn't quite what it seems, the actual sort of partnership is very, very important. And I think, even if you just look at how Israel's Netanyahu is feeling a little bit, a silent spectator looking in, I think those kind of optics tell the more important story.
Okay, Flavia Kress-Jackson, our Executive Editor for Economics and Government, thank you very much for joining us.
Now, Burberry results yesterday added to the decade of troubles at the British fashion icon. Now it's out with elevating the brand and in with cost-cutting. Bloomberg's Tiwa Adebayo joins us with more on this story. Good morning. What's been going wrong at Burberry? I think this feels a bit like a moment, the realisation of how difficult it's been.
Yeah, Caroline, it does seem that there comes a time in the life of most luxury fashion houses when they face this sort of tug of war, really, between creativity and economics. And that seems to be the key issue, I think, that's plaguing Burberry at the moment. Yes, the luxury sector is facing a downturn, but it seems like Burberry's problems are a bit worse. Their shares have massively underperformed the S&P Global Luxury Index, for example. And the brand does look like it's facing a bit of an identity crisis that has been punctuated by faltering shares. And that all came to a head yesterday when the CEO, Joshua Schulman, announced that the firm is making historic job cuts. They're getting rid of a fifth of their entire workforce. And to his mind, Burberry is struggling really because it's strayed too far from its traditional roots. And that's really the internal tension that's been gripping the house for the last few years. There was an attempt by the previous creative director, Riccardo Tisci. He wanted to pivot the brand into modernity and also appeal more to Asian markets. You might have seen the firm ditch its signature logo in favour of this sort of double B monogram, playing into the logo mania craze a bit. And they featured some designs that were more akin to streetwear than heritage, so not what you typically see from Burberry. But then they switched back again and they brought in the new designer Daniel Lee from Bottega Veneta. He's the current creative director. He was really known at Bottega for spearheading viral it handbags, a big focus on accessories. Under his leadership of Burberry, we've definitely seen the brand come back further to its roots. It's said that he's bringing Britishness back, and we saw actually a couple of seasons ago they had a really eye-catching Fashion Week campaign. It featured the takeover of a traditional English cafe and also renaming Bond Street Station to Burberry Street. So there was a clear attempt to really align the brand back with the idea of Britishness, cool Britannia. And now actually, if you've been at Heathrow Terminal 5 recently, you can see their spearhead campaign for this year, which features a number of British icons. There's Naomi Campbell in there, and they have also very closely integrated the imagery of the knight, which is the traditional Burberry logo, and that's blazoned across the arrivals section of Heathrow Airport. So it seems that this new CEO is trying to sort of finally unlock the answers to pleasing the Burberry audience. That seems to be the key issue they've been facing, falling out of touch with their core consumer.
So the CEO's plan now seems to involve a lot of cost cutting.
Yeah, it does seem like Schulman really wants to strip things back to basis on more than one level. He looks like he's targeting a more mid-market consumer, and that definitely tracks with his previous experience. He's led brands like Coach and Michael Kors that really speak to that upper mid elevated basics market. On the business side, he's also planning to majorly pull back on spending, so perhaps an end to those costly viral Fashion Week campaigns like naming the tube station, for example. But essentially, he thinks that for too long, Burberry has been trying to compete in the sort of upper echelons of the fashion couture world. They've been trying to compete with the likes of Bottega Veneta, for example, bringing in Daniel Lee and Jacques Mus, and it's not working. He says that there's been too much of an emphasis on designing popular, expensive handbags and intricate designs, and now he wants the brand to go back to doing what it knows best. So that means more outerwear and, crucially, more of the traditional Burberry check print. Now, so far, it looks like analysts business like what he has to say. Burberry shares were up 17% at the close yesterday following his results update. And it should be noted that they did actually outperform expectations in their most recent round of results. So maybe he'll finally be the CEO who does manage to marry up that economic and creative side of Burberry.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day, right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.